Good afternoon, everyone online in the room. Thanks very much for joining us both in this room and also online. There are many audience online. My name is Kang. I am Assistant Professor of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. Today we are very delighted to be able to host this panel on Sino-US relations in the Biden era, and this is a great timing, on the first day when Joe Biden takes office. So first, I'd like to invite the organizers of this event, Professor Cole, our department head, and also Dr. Kenneth Chen, Director of Comparative Governance and Policy Research Center, to give brief opening remarks and welcome our guests.
Thanks very much, Kang. You've done me the honor of saying that I'm the organizer of the event, but not really, of course. This event is part of our center. It's part of our general interest. We try and keep an ongoing dialogue, really, both, which can be area specific, but is also extremely reactive to events. Now, clearly, we are the first day here. We're the first day of the new Biden presidency. We have some excellent expertise within and beyond our department. And as head of Department of Government and International Studies, I'm delighted, actually, that we can invite colleagues from Chinese University and Lingnan to join us. And I'm really, really looking forward to this. Of course, we're used to Professor Cabestan. We're very pleased that he's with us and he will give us his wisdom today. But it's great to encourage this pan-Hong Kong discussion and dialogue. So let's without further ado, let me hand over to you, Kenneth.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Cole. Thank you, Dr. Kang, for moderating this very important event for us. And indeed, I suppose a lot of people have already watched the inauguration, which happened late last night, and maybe in a very celebrative mode, or rather less sometimes, depending on where you stand. But anyway, what we are trying to deal with today is a very important issue that is very close to our hearts and minds as well, which is Sino-US relations in the Biden era. And I'm no expert, so I'm here to learn. And I very much welcome everybody joining us by Zoom or other means to take an active part in this discussion. I suppose a lot of people have various concerns over Hong Kong and future relations between China and the US. So without much ado, I welcome everybody, and the center that we have at this department, which is the Comparative Governance and Policy Research Center, is always welcoming new ideas. So please consider us as one of your closest allies and partners as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Cole, and thanks, Kenneth. So, yesterday I watched the inauguration, and indeed, these several months, U.S. politics and U.S.-China relations have appeared on the front pages of almost every mainstream newspaper, and also among the headlines of all kinds of media and social media. So I myself have a lot of questions actually in my mind, like what might be the new direction of U.S. foreign policy and especially Asian policy amid its domestic crisis in the Biden era. What might be what might be the continuing change in China's foreign policy agenda in response to the new government in the U.S. And how will the pandemic, as well as Trump's legacies in both positive and negative sense, shape future U.S.-China relations? I have all those questions, and I'm sure everyone here, online attending this event and in this room, we are all concerned about these issues, and our audience must have many more questions in their mind. So we are very delighted to have three experts in international relations and U.S.-China politics to talk to us about these issues. Let's welcome our three guests. Our dear colleague, Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan, Chair Professor of Political Science at Hong Kong Baptist University, and two of our distinguished guests, Professor Zhang Baohui, Professor of Political Science at Lingnan University, and Dr. Wong, Assistant Professor of Government and Public Administration, and also Director of International Affairs Research Center at Chinese University of Hong Kong. So each of our speakers will talk for about 15 minutes, and after their speeches, we should have a 40-minute Q&A session. And we encourage the audience to submit questions even during the speakers' talks. And we'll try to get to all of your questions. But I want to apologize in advance to those questions if we don't have time to deal with. Okay, so maybe we should start immediately. Professor Cabestan, let me now turn to you. So.
A lot for inviting me. Sorry, I have to remove my mask because I cannot breathe without a mask. With a mask. And thank you for taking part in this talk. I keep my distance from other participants. I didn't watch Biden's inauguration yesterday. I was sleeping because I wanted to get ready for these talks. I needed to have a good sleep, and I had a good sleep. So I'm ready now to share with you my views about the Sino-US relations in the Biden era, conflict, competition, and cooperation. First of all, I would say that, as you may know, China was very slow to react to Biden's victory. It's only late November that Xi Jinping called for Biden and expressed his hope that China and the US will uphold the spirit of non-conflict, non-confrontation, and mutual respect and win-win cooperation. So he was already kind of echoing the title of this presentation. Going a bit further, Fu Ying, the former ambassador Fu Ying, qualified the relationship to the US and China as a co-opetition, so a mixture of cooperation and competition. And another quite well-known analyst from China, a realist actually, Professor Hong, he was saying that any improvement of Sino-US relations is wishful thinking because of the unpredictability, uncertainty of the relationship, which will continue in the coming years. So, and because the world is going to be a little more chaotic than before. So, I think there is, in spite of those daunting remarks by Jean-Pierre, I think there is a consensus in China, and maybe it's a wishful thinking, that with Biden coming into office, there will be a reset of the Sino-US relation, a reset. My argument actually is that it's not going to happen. I think that under Biden, there will be more continuity, that changes and differences in the US-China, in the Americas-China policy, because there's a growing bipartisan awareness in the United States that China is not only a repressive regime, but also pose economic and perhaps military threat to the United States. And more generally, China jeopardized the United States leading role in world affairs. Of course, Biden teams sometimes occasionally send mixed signal, but overall, if you look at the administration which is coming in, it's very much a tough line which has been adopted. And I can't refrain from I picked that copy of the Pinggu Report in our country, and I don't know if you can read in Chinese. In Chinese, it says very clearly, 中国是最大的威胁. So it means that China is the most the gravest threat to the United States, and maybe to the people, to the Apple Daily News as well, in many ways. So, but it set the tone for this coming administration, at least in the eyes of opposition members in Hong Kong. Now, if you look at the teams put together by the Biden administration, I would qualify that team as a bunch of democratic hawks and realists. Most of them, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Gabriel Haynes for National Intelligence, Kirk Campbell, whom I know rather well, but also Michael Chain in the Defense Department, Eli Rachner, also advisor on China at the Pentagon. I mean, as a result, I think that for China, maybe the Biden administration will be a more poison gift than the good news. It will be more predictable, more steady, but at the same time, the danger for China that the US will maybe stronger than the Trump, because it will reach out its allies more often and will try to overcome once he does overcome the COVID-19 crisis, he may be from an economic and military point of view stronger than before. Now, there will be a number of changes. I will sort of very briefly, in the time which has been given to me, try to look at the changes which are going to take place. I think there will be a change of style to start with. No more tweets, I guess, but also more contacts. And, you know, there are signals that the high-level contact will resume very quickly. There's been indication that Jean-Pierre, the Politburo member in charge of foreign affairs, will soon visit Washington, D.C. And there will be more areas of cooperation, clearly. Biden, because Biden has already embraced a number of multilateral agreements, including the Paris Climate Change Agreement. The US will return to the WHO, that's been already decided. And more generally, the US will be more active in the UN system. There are questions, of course, about whether the Biden administration will revive the P5+1 agreement with Iran. It's maybe more difficult, but it will likely move in that direction. I think on economic issues, I think economic decoupling will maybe stop or be at least more selective, and the trade war will be maybe less acute. I think the Biden administration will be more organized in its battle to impose a kind of more leveled playing field with China. It will also renegotiate the phase 1 deal of January 2020. On tariffs, I don't think that tariffs are going to be lifted anytime soon, but there is also an awareness in the US that the trade deficit has actually increased in spite of the tariff imposed by the Trump administration. So now the pressure from the US companies may intensify in order to also to stabilize the relationship with China, because 75% of US companies present in China wants to stay there, no intention to move their production lines out of China. Now there may be also more caution in the use of the Committee of Foreign Investment, CCIS, in order to review cases of investments. And I think that it's also likely that the Biden administration will gradually reduce the list of blacklisted Chinese companies with link with the PLA. Not all of them, and the question of whether Chinese companies with link with the PLA or SOEs will continue to be delisted from the stock exchange in New York. I think it will be much more of a predictable question about TikTok and WeChat also. Maybe that will be revised. The decision made by the Biden administration will be revised. So there's a question about the US participation in the WTO, whether it will appoint new judges, which will allow the dispute settlement mechanism to be active again, and also regarding multilateral agreements, whether the US will join the TPP, which the Trump administration left in 2017. Now, on security issues, on Taiwan first, I think Biden will reaffirm China, the US One China policy. I don't think it will threaten it. It will also reaffirm the what I would call the US strategic ambiguity policy with this double deterrence policy towards Taiwan, and maybe we'll decide not to continue to organize high-profile visits to Taiwan as we had in the last few months, decided by the Biden administration. So, and finally, maybe the Seventh Fleet ships transit in the Taiwan Strait will be less visible, more discreet, if you want. On the South China Sea, I don't see any major change, but what I see is that there is maybe a possibility eventually that the American Congress ratify the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. There's still a lot of opposition against that in the US, but it will be very, very helpful for the US and for its argument to defend for instance, the 2016 arbitration award regarding South China Sea and the Philippines to ratify that UNCLOS. On North Korea, I see some possible changes which may instill some kind of cooperation with China because the Trump unilateral approach to North Korea has clearly failed. So I see some changes here. Finally, on human rights, I think there will be, I think, more activism and less activism. I think the problem with the Trump administration was that actually it woke up to human rights pretty late in the presidency. And I can see the Democrats being more ready to put pressure on China, be it on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, on the repression of political activists and dissidents in China. So, and finally, I think what is, I think it's been noted by quite a number of observers, is the fact that the Biden administration will strengthen the US relationship with its allies, both in Asia and in Europe, and will try to establish a kind of united front with the European Union on trade grievances with China, market access, forced technology transfers, subsidies to SOEs. It also will try, I think, to establish a more strategic and security-oriented united front with the US allies in Asia, the Quad with India, or partners with India, Australia, and Japan, and also with NATO, which raises another question regarding Europe strategic autonomy. So, but these trends have been also already pretty visible under the Trump administration, and even before the Trump administration, when Obama launched the pivot policy, pivot strategy, and rebalancing strategy. So, and now, what is I think quite important here are the elements of continuity, and here I think the Biden administration major objective will be to preserve the U.S. leadership, and without trying to fall in the Thucydides trap, which is, I think, a real danger. I think, on the one hand, some kind of distinction must be made, and we'll see that in discussion between what the Trump administration has decided about China, its policy drafted by a number of people, including Matt Pottinger, whom I know quite well, but also, and Trump himself, Trump's own intervention on Twitter, when Xi Jinping, when he qualified Xi Jinping as a very, very good friend of mine. I don't know to what extent that's true, but and those kind of statements didn't coincide with or didn't align with the Trump administration's China policy. Actually. On the other hand, I think any potential change in the U.S.-China policy will depend upon China very much, and whether it sticks to its warrior diplomacy, its increasing intrusion in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, across the middle line of the Taiwan Strait, or around the Senkaku Islands, whether it will keep putting pressure, economic pressure, and financial pressure on weaker countries, or middle-sized powers like Canada or Australia, and so frictions, strategic tensions, and even military crises will depend. The U.S. will depend partly upon China itself. Now, on trade and economic relations, I think the trade war, in my view, will carry on. There's been indication that mentioned that the tariff won't be lifted very quickly. The screening and vetting of technology transfer to China, and Chinese acquisition of sensitive U.S. companies or critical infrastructure will continue with the ceasefires. And of course, China will try to continue to lobby U.S. business community, Starbucks chairman being a recent example, and there will be also pressure against any from big companies against additional sanctions against China and Xinjiang, because the number of companies have interest there. But whether these lobby is going to succeed remains to be seen, because the Biden administration will be under strong pressure of the public opinion, but also the Congress to continue to abide by the recent decisions made by the Trump administration, including the December 2020 Holding Foreign Company Accountable Act, which was supported by a large majority in Congress. On security, I think the Biden administration won't be able to ignore the recent U.S. strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific, which was approved in February 2018, and which was declassified on purpose by the Biden administration in January 2021, 20 years ahead of schedule. And but I think beyond that, the major reason is that the Biden administration agreed with most of the content of that framework. Maintain U.S. strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific, preventing China from establishing a new liberal sphere of influence. U.S. alliances are key. I mean, all those points are very, and stronger. India is also important as a counterbalance to China. So, so I see a lot of elements in that argument which the Biden administration will stick to, including on Taiwan and the first island chain, on which I think the Biden administration will continue to emphasize the importance of defending Taiwan against military aggression and facilitating the country's development of asymmetric strategies and capabilities. And more broadly, I think the idea was by the US will be to continue to prevent China from establishing sustained air and sea dominance inside the first island chain in a conflict. So I think that's going to remain a pretty strong feature of continuity between the Trump and the Biden administration. On Taiwan, I think again, I mean, first just an example, the Taiwan representative to Washington, Xiaobin, took part in the inauguration of the Biden administration, which is the first time I think in Chinese in U.S. Taiwan relations. Sale will carry on, and I think the U.S. will continue to fight for a greater participation, more meaningful participation of Taiwan in international organizations and to prevent any change to the status quo of Taiwan. On the South China Sea, I think again, I mean, the freedom of navigation operation will continue, and the assistance to other claimants also will continue. All right, now on human rights, I think there will be also a lot of continuity. I don't see the Biden administration lifting any of the sanctions taken on, against foreign sanctions against Hong Kong officials or Chinese officials. On Xinjiang, actually, finally on Xinjiang, the decision made by the State Department of Pompeo just the day before it stepped down to qualify what's happening in Xinjiang as a crime against humanity and a genocide. That was asked by the Democrats, actually. So the Biden administration will be ill positioned to change that statement, even if we can discuss about what extent it's a genocide. I looked at the UN Convention on Genocide. There are some questions. Now, finally, my conclusion that there are some good news and bad news for China. The good news is that the Chinese economy is living in kitchen. Main source of growth in the coming years. I think China will be in a stronger position than before COVID and before the Trump years to face China and to face the United States. And as a number of Chinese officials have said, Dongsheng Xijiang, the West is rising and the East is declining, and I think there's a strong belief that it will carry on and that China needs to take the lead in a number of issues on the international stage. Now, the other good news for China is that many of the Biden administration's objectives will be made difficult to be reached, including with the European Union, because there are still differences between the EU and China and the US on a number of issues, on tariff, on digital companies, taxation, and more importantly, whether the EU and Europe should promote this strategic autonomy, and to what extent. I think the EU member states are divided on that issue. So there are I think important differences there. The bad news for China is that I think the US has adopted the bipartisan view on the fact that China is the US major challenge in the long run. And if you read Campbell's recent published article, he said, left unchecked, Chinese behavior could end the region's long peace. That's what Campbell said not long ago. Consequently, the US needs to keep Indo-Pacific a balanced plan in order that the region states recognize, in order that the region states recognize it legitimate and set up an allied and partner coalition that can address China's challenge to both. So it means that the Biden administration will not adopt a weak China policy. The second challenge for China is that the US will be in a stronger position because the US will be more united and will be more supported by outside partners. And the final problem for China is that its image around the world, particularly in the democratic world, has seriously deteriorated. And it will be hard for China to mend that image in the coming years. So I think I will end my short presentation on that note, and I hope we can come back to this issue later in the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Will be amended.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure, great. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me at the Hong Kong Baptist University. Thanks, great thanks to the department. I'm very glad to be back here. Just to digress a little bit, a quick shout out to my father, who I think it's among the audience. My father is Dr. Simon Wong. Before he retired a couple of years ago, he worked here for like 30 years, and before he retired, he was the dean of the School of Continuing Education here. So it might be, and this is actually my first time be on campus as a scholar speaking to an audience. Before that, I was mostly coming in for the Christmas dinners and pulling the long beard of the Santa Claus, who must have hated me over the years. So enough digression. So what I'm going to do in the next 50 minutes or so is to offer a rough contour of what US policy towards China might look like under Biden, and in a way echoing and complementing what many of the insights that Professor Cabestan and Professor Zhang have offloaded to us already. And to that end, I'd like to call your attention to a couple of articles that were recently published in the magazine Foreign Affairs, including the one that Professor Zhang mentioned at the end of this presentation. Now, with these articles, I also wish to dispel some of the, in my opinion, rather misguided beliefs about Biden's likely approach towards China. I've seen circulating rampantly in social media, particularly by some self-ordained KOLs on US-China relations. Mainly to engage. I know there are a lot of people from outside of academia or university participating in over Zoom right now. For obvious reasons, there's a lot of Hong Kongers have keen interest on the subject. Right? And these articles I'm about to discuss are revealing and authoritative not because of their content, the ideas they contain per se, but because of the identity of their authors. So the first one is entitled, as Professor Zhang mentioned, Competition Without Catastrophe, How America Can Both Challenge and Coexist with China, published some 50 months ago before the pandemic by Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan. Kurt Campbell, as many of you know, had been tapped by Biden to assume the newly created position Senior Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Policy in his National Security Council. Campbell was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs under Obama. He was one of the main proponents and brains behind Obama's so-called pivot to Asia. He has been dubbed the Asia Czar and is expected to play a leading role in formulating Biden's China policy. Meanwhile, Jake Sullivan is Biden's national security advisor. He served in the same role to Biden when he was his vice president. Biden, I assume, would not have picked these two individuals to take up such important roles in his administration without first knowing and understanding, and in a way agreeing with them on their take on China. So what do they argue in this article, and what can we infer from it concerning Biden's likely approach towards China? Now, first of all, Campbell and Sullivan make very clear upfront that the era of engagement with China is over. Diplomatic and economic engagement, that is America's modus operandi towards China for the past 4 decades, has not brought about the changes to China's political system, its economy, its foreign policy behavior that proponents of engagement had hoped for. So they believe that, the belief that a Biden presidency, which is very common as I see among Hong Kongers, the belief that a Biden presidency would just return to business as usual with China, that is engagement, is just flat out wrong. And you're not hearing that from me, you're hearing that from Campbell and Sullivan. That is those who will actually be running the show, right? And Campbell and Sullivan, however, argue that it would be fallacious to assume that just because the strategy hasn't worked out the way you expect, its exact opposite would.
They cautioned Washington against, quote, making a similar mistake today by assuming that competition can succeed in transforming China where engagement failed. That is, this time by forcing the capitulation or even collapse of the country of China. In particular, the US must resist the understandable temptation to reach back to the only great power competition Americans remember to make sense of the present one, the Cold War, end quote. For decades, the strategy against the Soviet Union was essentially one of containment, as I'm sure you know, under the assumption that with time and pressure, the Soviet empire would crumble under its own weight. It eventually did, but just because the outcome of that competition was favorable from the American perspective does not mean that the strategy used to work would equally work well in the case of modern day China. The analogy is tempting and easy and is becoming somewhat focused these days in Hong Kong, to say the least, but it is wrong because it masks some and belies some real differences that actually matter. And among others, the Chinese party state has proven to be a lot more resilient, its practice of diplomacy far more sophisticated and much more flexible ideologically than the Soviet Union ever was. The Soviet Union was in nowhere near compared to China today in terms of economic and technological prowess. China is also far more connected and interdependent economically, technologically, and at the everyday people-to-people level with the rest of the world. Many of the global problems we face, climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, economic crises, to name just a few, did not exist or were far less acute during the Cold War. To tackle these problems will require joint effort with China, like it or not. Right? So the risk Armageddon, because war, nuclear or not, because of allowing global warming to run amok, that comes with a Cold War style strategy of containment would be, to say the least, unwise and irresponsible. Instead, Campbell and Sullivan proposed a number of initiatives they believe would enable the US to compete with China, keep its influence and ambitions in check, hold it accountable for its behavior domestically and internationally, yet at the same time to coexist with it and cooperate in areas of mutual interest. On the military front, they argue for the need to enhance bilateral crisis management that will include clearer and more detailed rules of engagement be put in place to prevent misunderstandings, particularly in the flashpoints like the South China Sea, that have the potential to spiral off control, strengthening communication channels and mechanisms to avoid conflicts, and to allow senior military officials from both sides to engage in more frequent and substantive discussions to build personal ties and to better understand each other's operations. The US would also need to strengthen its deterrent capacity. It should, among other measures, reorient its investment towards what they call cheaper asymmetric capabilities designed to discourage Chinese adventurism, such as long-range unmanned carrier-based strike aircraft, unmanned underwater vehicles, guided missile submarines, and high-speed strike weapons. It should also further increase its military presence in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. So in that way, I see a continuity from the Trump administration I would actually give Obama more credit to that with its earlier plan to pivot towards Asia. Right? At home, to better equip itself, the US must dramatically increase investment in research, in the basic science, in education and infrastructure, in clean energy, biotech, AI, and computing power. And finally, Campbell and Sullivan emphasized the need for a multilateral approach rather than going it alone. And I think that would be the aspect in Biden's approach to foreign policy that'd be the most different from that of Trump. They wrote, quote, "The combined weight of US allies and partners can shape China's choices across all domains in trade, security, technology, safeguarding democratic values and human rights, but only if Washington deepens all those relationships and works to tie them together. The US will ultimately need to embed its China strategy in a dense network of relationships and institutions in Asia and the rest of the world," end quote. Biden himself echoed many of Campbell Sullivan's ideas in an article of his own entitled "Why America Must Lead Again, Rescuing US Foreign Policy After Trump," also published in Foreign Affairs in March last year, as he was seeking for the nomination from his party. So Biden wrote, quote, "The most effective way to meet that challenge," meaning China, "is to build a united front of US allies and partners to confront China's abusive behaviors and human rights violations, even as we seek to cooperate with Beijing on issues where our interests converge, such as climate change, non-proliferation, and human health security," end quote. In his mind, the greatest sin that Trump committed on China and on any other foreign policy issues is that Trump has abdicated America's leadership in the world, in essence, by sabotaging the legitimacy and credibility he used to enjoy so much in the eyes of the allies. So Biden wrote, Trump, quote, "Trump has belittled, undermined, and in some cases abandoned US allies and partners. The US cannot be a credible voice while it is abandoning the deals it negotiated," in reference to the nuclear, Iranian nuclear deal, climate change agreement in Paris, etc. For Biden, it is imperative to mend these strained ties. And by the way, this has also been a theme running through some of the interviews that Antony Blinken, so Biden's presumed Secretary of State, has given recently. Since his election last November, Biden has offered some more concrete ideas, some clues on how he actually intends to proceed instead of just remaining at a theoretical level. So he told Thomas Friedman in an interview last December, quote, "The best China strategy is one which gets every one of our, or at least what used to be our allies on the same page. It's going to be a major priority for me in the opening weeks, which is now, of my presidency to try to get us back on the same page with our allies," end quote. He has promised an immediate full review of US-China policy and consult with allies to develop, quote, "a coherent strategy." He has also set to put in place what he calls a Summit of Democracies, or D10, with its members being the G7 democracies plus Australia, India, and South Korea, where its leaders will come together to meet regularly to discuss and work out plans for, among other things, like military cooperation and the co-development of crucial technologies, right, such as 5G, to counter and catch up with the lead that China currently enjoys. Biden and his team has also gone to some length, and I think, to make sure that people understand multilateralism. The multilateral approach is not just some nice sounding term that reeks of idealism, but lacks actual purpose and substance. Right? Instead, they see it as the only logical and strategically sound way to keep the pressure on China in the long haul. It's the only sustainable way. It is a realist approach designed to make sure everyone is on board without feeling being bullied or strong-armed. In the terms we use in international relations theory, right, to make sure that no partner or ally free rides or defects, right, from its share of responsibility in managing China's rise or challenge. As Jake Sullivan once explained on the subject of trade, quote, "China always sought an escape hatch through their economic relationships with others. Only by closing off those escape hatches would you get China to curb their trade abuses," end quote. So to give you some example, Rex Tillerson, so Trump's first Secretary of State, actually opposed Trump's decision to withdraw from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because he thought that with the move, the US had willfully and willingly surrendered its influence in the Asia-Pacific Rim. All the while, China was concluding its own trade pact with its neighbors, the RCEP, and grew closer with them as a result. Another example that Biden and his team likes to cite to demonstrate the need for multilateralism is how the US and its partners together managed to make China drop its export quota on rare earths in 2015. China's decision to drop the export quota came after it lost the case brought against it at the WTO by the US, EU, Japan, Australia, and some other 15 countries. Many of these countries had never taken a case against China at the WTO before, and the coalition was not given, was not by default it could happen. It only materialized because largely as a result of active US diplomacy, particularly by trade officials such as Catherine Tai, Daiqi, right, who, as you know, is now Biden's nominee for the role of US Trade Representative. Biden's emphasis on multilateralism and his team's emphasis on multilateralism might, in fact, in part explain why, by some accounts, Beijing actually prefers dealing with Trump. Trump can be a pain in the neck because he has a tendency to shoot off his hip, or I guess off his fingers on Twitter. But Beijing knows that as long as Trump is at the helm, right, the U.S. will never again have the moral authority to galvanize and lead a global coalition against it. So I'm going to stop here because I think I'm running off time. I do have some comments and observations I can make further on the team itself, on Biden's foreign policy making apparatus, the team, but I could leave that to later on to Q&A if there's interest. Thank you.
So thank you very much to all the guests. I guess to be more efficient, maybe we will collect a number of questions for two rounds. Maybe we can first collect questions inside this room, and then let the speakers, pick up the points that they want to comment and they want to respond to. All right. So yeah, in this room, yeah, please.
Okay. How many questions can I ask?
Maybe two.
So I asked one question and also commented it. Well, thanks a lot to all presenters. It was very interesting and as it was mentioned, very timely. So without further ado, I've got a question that kind of draws on Professor Zhang Baohui comments on ideas in terms of politics. The new administration and Democrats in the US, and especially Kamala Harris, are known in Europe and, well, I should say from kind of a center or right perspective, they are seen as very progressive, very progressive. And in that regard, US would be rather following European Union, I suppose. So do you think, it's a question to both to Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan and Professor Zhang Baohui, do you think that this is actually going to be a factor in future US-China relations? You did signal it, but I would like, if possible, for you to comment further. Because, progressives being progressives, China, after all, is a communist country, and a lot of leftists in Europe, they've always kind of flirted with a kind of a leftist agenda. That's the question. I've got three very brief comments, if I can. The realm of political economy, I think we also have to look at this when it comes to US-China relations in the future. The Economic Forum has been talking about signaling the Great Reset. Have you heard about that? The Great Economic Reset. Well, it's not just a conspiracy theory if the Economic Forum actually openly talks about this. And in this regard, to my mind at least, the game now is about the future of the financial system, especially the currency, and I know for a fact that China has been really pressing this issue for some time, trying to outweigh the American dollar as a currency. So I think this is something we have to look at in the future. Last thing, COVID-19. I mean, if you look at the Chinese economy, it seems to be doing pretty great. Unlike the American economy or the European economies, who are still in lockdown, which proves devastating. Just I think recently I read that most Europeans think in the next 10 years China will actually overtake the US economy as the biggest, as the best economy, the biggest producer in the world. So yeah, these are my thoughts. Thank you. Okay. One question.
And any other question in the room? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the presenters. I have a question for Professor Zhang. When you were presenting, you mentioned something that Trump used to say Xi Jinping is his great friend. But
I mentioned it earlier.
Oh, but he acted differently. Now, you quoted something about Joe Biden saying that it is the end of China is no more a threat, but is a challenge. So what is the difference between the two? Because how are we sure that this person will really take those difference between a threat and a challenge seriously and not like paying lip service to these words?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Professor Kang.
I had just a quick comment, not actually a question, but it's very interesting to observe the three presentations, because in a sense, the three are addressing the same question, and the conclusions are not far apart. But it's very interesting to see how each three of our colleagues adopted a rather different take. You know, I mean, Professor Cabestan gave an overview very much based on expert knowledge of the field, what was likely to happen. Professor Zhang gave very much a theoretical view that was perhaps that was equally interesting from a different perspective. Perhaps a bit less rooted in practice, but clearly looking to, I mean, what would IR theory expect us to think really with this? And then Sean, Dr. Wong gave us another view that was very interesting, based in a sense on a reading of articles, but also what was interesting here, I think, was to say, and in a way, if there's a sort of practice-focused approach from Jean-Pierre Cabestan and more of a theory approach from Professor Zhang, here I think we have in a sense, a policy environment type of approach. Because as you rightly pointed out, I mean, over 20, 30 years or whatever, the issues shift, global warming, COVID, these are all issues. So in a sense, the agenda shifts. So I think we have to, and clearly the synthesis of these three is that all three are necessary, obviously, and that we have to some extent to integrate theory, practice, and overarching evolution of society into our understanding of the subject. So it was a comment, not a question.
Yeah.
Thanks so much indeed, all three distinguished guests, giving us very updated and I would say very nuanced understanding about the upcoming US-China relations in the Biden era. As a Hong Kong person, I cannot help but considering our situation, the geostrategic, maybe embarrassing situation to some people of Hong Kong. To Sean, maybe more specifically, since we're all based here. To what extent do you think Hong Kong may still be a factor in terms of managing the future ties between Washington and Beijing during the Biden era, given the fact that the Trump administration recently issued the Congressional Executive Report on China, mentioning that one country, two systems as a policy has been dismantled. So it's a pretty strong and categorical negative verdict on Hong Kong's realities. Now, would the Biden administration find a way out of this situation, or do you think there's going to be more continuation than change over the verdict on Hong Kong? And if so, what would mean for the future ties between Washington and Beijing under Biden's leadership? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So should we collect all the questions together? Because there are two questions from online.
Okay.
Maybe we just combine all the questions together and then let the speakers respond to the points they wanted. So
Now we have three now.
okay.
Three questions.
Okay.
Maybe later.
Maybe later.
Maybe later.
Okay, so
Let's
let's
with
do
the
it. Yeah.
questions,
And,
Okay, my turn.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, sorry, I have to take off my mask to start. Well, I'm also a realist in a way, but of a different breed, because I really believe in the importance of ideologies and ideas as well as important balance of power. So I think what we have to look at today in this US-China relationship is both capabilities and intentions. In terms of capabilities, I would echo what Chris was saying, that China is more powerful economic power, also more powerful military, with a navy which has more ships now than the US Navy. It's something which has been noted pretty well in Washington, D.C., which is trying to catch up, and I think Biden will continue to catch up. But I think also intentions are important. And if the Xi Jinping administration intention is to reunify with Taiwan, I had a question on that before, well, let's say 2021 or 2049 or whatever. That's going to turn China into a real threat to the United States. We have a commitment to, not officially to defend Taiwan, but to keep the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. So I think it will depend on China, and I can see in this balance of power game, China being on a weak side, because what country can China rely on apart from Russia? But Russia is the kind of middle power now, with a GDP which is much smaller than China and or the US, and the US can rely on a number of Asian and European allies, in particular Asian allies. And I would say that in spite of what Trump did in the last 4 years, the Trump administration relationship with its Asian allies has been much better than with its European allies, and that's what matters as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. Now, Harris, yes, is progressive, but I don't think it's good. Well, but left-leaning people in Europe, they tend to to emphasize the importance of human rights. So on that particular issue, they're going to put more pressure. They're going to put more pressure on the Biden administration than the business community, which has tried to prevent a number of new acts on Xinjiang and other issues to be passed by the Congress. So I don't see here being really a meaningful factor. As far as the financial system is concerned, don't keep in mind that the yuan is not a convertible currency. There is no way for the yuan to compete with the US dollar. Yes, currency may be important. China will set up its own system, but it will remain, in my view, marginal. But that's my own view. COVID-19, yes, the impact on the Chinese economy has been much less severe than the Western economies. I agree. We have to look at the longer-term implication of what's going on in China. What is the economic situation of China? Yes, China has achieved a better growth rate and will achieve this year 6%, maybe 6.5%, last year 2.3%. But we have to look at the structural problems which the Chinese economy is facing in terms of the role of the SOEs, the importance of exports and investment as opposed to consumptions in China's economic development. I think the number of structural changes which are going in, and not to mention the debt issue, the internal debt issue, local government and SOEs debt issue, which are going to, and increasing inequalities. And that's something which the Xi Jinping will need to address in the Chinese society, because we see more and more resentment against the rich and the powerful in China. So, there are a number of domestic issues which I think the Communist Party will need to face in the future. I would like to sort of push Baohui a bit further, because on this difference between, and that's echo Conrad's question, on the differences between challenges and threats. I think that's good for diplomats. I'm no diplomat. Yes, of course, you can't call China a foe, but whatever you say about Chinese communist dictatorship, it's like you are a rival. Okay, rival may be more neutral, but I tend to call a spade, and I have to say that there is an ideological, strategic, and rivalry and economic competition which is continuing to grow. Why? Because China is getting getting more powerful and becoming a more meaningful threat than 10 or 20 years ago to the US interests. So, and as you said, we agree on that. That US is number one, is not going to see this place without a fight. I think now whether this fight is going to be bloody or will be peaceful, we don't know. But China is taking more risks, and that's why what I'm worried about. And I agree with you that the Taiwan Strait is maybe a hot issue, maybe a flashpoint. And for the last thing, the Biden administration would like to manage the military crisis in the Taiwan Strait, but it depends upon the PLA and Xi Jinping. If they want to have a fight, they have a fight. So. Because Taiwan, because the US, in spite of what you say, may be more discreet, but every year you have 3,000 Pentagon officials going to Taiwan. Every year, 3,000 to 4,000. It's not going to stop. They will continue the submarine program. They will continue to arm Taiwan and to develop, as you said, asymmetrical and deterrent capabilities in the Indo-Pacific in order to prevent China from being adventurous. So that here, I think yes, the agenda shift is important, as you mentioned, Alistair, and that may, so divert the attention of great powers from those issues to climate change and other issues. But whether it will compete, I think both. I mean, both governments can do both at the same time, and. The problem with the Hong Kong is because there was a question about Hong Kong. We all live in Hong Kong, and I think that there's a strong consensus in the US that the one country two system has been dismantled, formula has been dismantled. The wage was conceived by Deng Xiaoping 40 years ago. So, and now whether the Biden administration can do more than the Trump administration, my assumption is it's very hard to do very much. I mean, to have an impact on what's going on here. And I think everybody in the US is pretty aware of the fact that there's not much leverage on Hong Kong on the part of the US or any other countries on Hong Kong. So that's why I think we have to be realistic.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it.
Space race.
Sean.
I forgot space race. The next thing.
Oh, space race. Yeah, it is,
Sorry,
of course.
Sean.
Space, cyber.
Sure, I'll just be very quick in my comment because I know we're running out of time. I totally agree with what Professor Cabestan just said about the case of Hong Kong. So, in fact, I mean, if it's any consolation to anyone, depending on your perspective, I guess, would be if I have to put my money somewhere between Trump and Biden, I would actually have more faith in Biden when it comes to things like human rights, including the case of Hong Kong and Xinjiang or anywhere else in the world. I mean, I was never convinced that Trump really cared about Hong Kong at all. To him, it's just a bargaining chip. It could be that I mean, he was dismissive of the protest movement earlier on, and we know that from John Bolton's memoir, he actually gave Xi Jinping a green light on Xinjiang. He's a businessman. He doesn't care. He would sell Ivanka Trump if the price is right. So I don't think he gives he's perfectly comfortable with children being separated from their families forever at the Mexican border. I don't think he gives anything about human rights. I mean, you have Mike Pompeo coming to the scene, who seems very gung-ho and aggressive when it comes to these issues, has a very Manichaean black-white view of the world. But for me, a lot of it is just spectacles. I mean, the so-called sanctions, for instance, against Chinese or Hong Kong officials, there's a massive literature in IR that shows exactly why sanctions don't work. And it won't work. And therefore, I agree with Professor Cabestan earlier, there's not much they could do when it comes to Hong Kong. But as a matter of principle, I think Biden, well, historically, you could argue in some way the Democratic Party is the party of human rights compared to the Republicans when it comes to China, right? The big business's influence on Republicans, that's historically. But I feel it still rings true a little bit to a certain extent, given what we've heard from Antony Blinken, from Biden himself, from the other members of the team when it comes to human rights, when it comes to Hong Kong, and to Xinjiang, like the rest of the world. Whereas I'd rather have him than a businessman being in charge of American foreign policy in that regard.
Thanks. Thank you. We have quite many questions from online, actually. Maybe Terence can read them.
Yeah. Now we have a growing list, so it's start really quick. The first question here. The Taiwan issue has always been an insurmountable obstacle in China-US relations. How do you comment on the change of strategies between China and the US regarding Taiwan? And then the next part was the pandemic has accelerated the change of world order. China has completed its economic recovery in a very short time. Will the world order change during Biden's administration and directly lead to the return of Taiwan? So that's one question.
Can you read more questions?
Yeah, just
There's another one, I think.
Yeah.
The US factor in the
Taiwan.
China-EU comprehensive agreement.
Right.
yeah.
I think
Let's read them all together.
from our alumni. Has there already been any sign that the Biden administration assess and will assess the China-EU comprehensive agreement on investment? And what is the US factor that can be told in the CAI, the comprehensive investment agreement?
Maybe you just read all the questions because we don't have much time left,
Yeah.
and we can collect all the questions.
Right. Next one from the US engagement policy is now seen as too conciliatory. On the other hand, the Trumpist formulation that China is an existential threat is unrealistic. The key is to find a middle ground between these two extremes. What should it be called? Realism, pragmatism, or do we need to call it anything at all? But from a US point of view,
handle issues case by case in accordance with U.S. interests.
So it's more like a comment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there is a previous question.
Yes. If we all agree that Biden will do a better job than Trump in representing the liberal world, in that sense, does it necessarily indicate the intention between U.S. and China will be elevated?
Okay, so that's all, right?
Yeah.
That's all
Yeah, I
the
mean,
questions
okay.
from online. So yeah, we can have a speaker comment on that. Professor Zhang?
I think the Taiwan issue is quite important, but Cabestan is an expert on that. Maybe.
Well, we want me to start. Okay, start. Maybe that will give you some ideas. You may disagree with me. I think on Taiwan, it's pretty clear to me to solve the issue, you need to ask the Taiwanese what they think. And the Taiwanese doesn't want unification. Of course, most Chinese maybe want unification, but Taiwanese don't want unification and they want to be part of China. I mean, the 92 consensus is still, according to which there is one China, is still promoted by Kuomintang, but it's not supported by the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, and the current political majority in Taiwan. So the question down the road, of course, is whether any future US administration will twist Taiwan's elbow and force it to abide by the 92 consensus. That's maybe what the Chinese government would like to see. What's going to happen in the next 4 years? No. In the longer term, I don't think so. But some people may think that in the longer run, that the U.S. administration won't have any other option but to accept that. Put more pressure on the Taiwanese authorities. But I don't see it. So again, what is important is to keep status quo in the strait and to prevent any adventurous move from taking place. And that's why I hope that after, now that Biden is in office, administration is office, the PLA will stop intruding in the Taiwanese airspace and beyond the medium line. But I don't know. I mean, that's, to me, it's a question mark. On the second question, which is the economy, well, I think I've already answered that. Yes, according to current estimates, by 2028, China will be the first economy in the world ahead of the United States. That's true. Whether it will be the first, military power is another story, I think. So there will be, I think, there's still a lot of competition between both nations, both countries, and I don't. Again, I think the U.S. will not lead the Asia Pacific, and that's where I think a big consensus among both the Republicans and the Democrats is that the United States is a Pacific nation with the invested interest in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific area, and that it will be part of the equation and can keep a favorable balance of power if it reaches out its allies in the region and beyond the region. Finally, on the CAI, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement. Personally, I think it was a mistake to complete that agreement, in between the Trump administration and the Biden administrations coming to office. There was no hurry. I mean, these negotiations have been going on for 7 years. You could have waited another few months. It would have been much better for the EU actually to first agree with the United States, which is allies of most European nations, on the strategy and the platform and regarding China before concluding that agreement. And so that's my own view. But as you know, the Biden administration is happy with that agreement, and they will. But now the EU say that it's not important. That we're still ready to work with the Americans. So we will wait and see on that, I'm sure.
Do you have?
I don't have any direct, I don't have anything to add on to questions in particular, but just one point I want to, it's in my notes, and since it's there, I better just lay it out instead of have to waste it. An observation I want to make about Biden's foreign policy team, which is that in contrast to Trump, actually a lot of administrations that came before him, and especially Trump, is phenomenal. It's actually quite impressive how well greased the machinery already is. I mean, this is a guy with many decades of foreign policy experience. You have both Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken were his national security advisor, right? So these are people he would work. So we've been discussing like what's the strategy would be, how it would look like. The question is, could they deliver it? But that's very much depends on how the machine works. And in the case of Trump, for instance, it was basically constant infighting. It was you have a plan, but you can execute it. So one comment I want to make, and I really want to contrast with the previous administration, is really just how much experience. It's not only experience in terms of personal experience, but experience of Biden actually working with the people he appointed, right? And in this regard, I expect the foreign policy making process or the scenery would be a lot more smoother than, of course, the downside of that we wouldn't be getting all these salacious and terrible accounts of infightings that we read from John Bolton or Rex Tillerson or Steve Bannon.
Professor Cabestan, have something to add?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, on this idea of bipolarity, yes. There is one thing which we haven't mentioned, which has Pompeo's letters idea, as one of Pompeo's letters idea, which has to criticize the Communist Party as opposed to China, and to sort of push more and more directly for a regime change in China. That's something which is clearly not on the agenda anymore, at least not in public. On the other side, the Trump administration, and you look at a number of documents issued by the State Department and the National Security Council, never fully abandoned an engagement policy. So it was a more selective engagement policy. But the term engagement was remained very much within the Trump administration policy towards China. So this will continue. And what will continue actually is a more selective engagement policy than before. But finally, I think the big competition, and I agree with Baohui, will be about technology. And China wants to catch up, will try its utmost to catch up and overtake the US. Well, whether it will succeed, we don't know. My hunch is it won't succeed and the US will keep an edge, but I'm not sure about it. Included.
Okay, so thank you everyone. Time is up. So thanks to Professor Zhang, Professor Cabestan, Dr. Wong. We had a fantastic panel. And also thank the audience online for joining us this afternoon. Have a good day. So thank you.